Okay. Well, we have a lot to talk about, so excited to get the conversation going. So welcome everyone to today's discussion, Labor at the Polls, Understanding How Union Members Approach the 2024 Election, co-hosted by the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School and the Center for Labor and a Just Economy at Harvard Law School. My name is Sharon Block. I'm a professor here at Harvard Law School and the executive director of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy. Before we get started, I just want to share a few brief announcements. First, today's discussion will be recorded. A link to the recording will be emailed to all registrants after the event, and you'll be able to find it on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. I'm really excited to get into this conversation and share with you the results of an important survey that we fielded to better understand how being in a union affected voters in the last presidential cycle. And I hope you'll find these results as fascinating as I do. And just so you know, the survey is part of a bigger body of work that we are doing at the Center for Labor and a Just Economy with partners like the Ash Center and our colleagues at Columbia. And the point of this bigger body of work is to understand how participating in workplace democracy impacts workers' relationship to our political democracy, a topic that we think grows in salience every day. So now it's my pleasure to briefly introduce the panelists and respondents for today's webinar. I'm just going to sort of run through everybody you're going to see over the course of our time together, and then we'll get into the substance. So first, it is really my pleasure to introduce Alex Hurdle Fernandez, who's the Associate Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs and co-director of the Columbia Labor Lab. He's a political scientist who studies the political economy of the United States with an emphasis on the politics of organized interests and public policy. He got his PhD in government and social policy here at Harvard, and he's the author of several amazing books, including, I think, most relevant for today's discussion, Politics at Work. Highly recommend it. Then also we have with us Max Kiefel, who I'm really honored to say is a fellow at the Center for Labor and a Just Economy. His research is in political sociology and comparative political economy. He received his PhD in government from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And Alan Yan is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley and the director of research at Indigo Engineering. He is broadly interested in the intersection of class, race, and ideology. So Alex, Max, and Alan will share findings from our new report, The Varied Voice of Labor, Unpacking the Political Engagement of Labor in the 2024 Election. We'll then turn the screen over to Mike Podharzer. Mike, your name always gets me, for a presentation on the union program and political communication in the 2024 election and beyond. Mike is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and chair of the Defend Democracy Project. Previously, he served as the political director for the AFL-CIO for over 25 years. And finally, we've invited two really special guests to weigh in with their perspectives about ongoing political engagement efforts across the country, the connection between union and political democracy, and where we might go from here. So joining us for that section of the webinar will be Kim Anderson, the executive director of the nation's largest labor union, National Education Association, which represents 3 million educators across the United States. Kim is the first woman and first person of color to serve in this role since the organization's founding in 1857. She's a graduate of George Washington University Law School. And finally, Stephanie Ternullo, who's an assistant professor of government here at Harvard. Her research uses multiple methods to explore how social contexts shape Americans' political behavior, and she received her PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. Just want you to know we'll reserve time at the end to respond to your questions. You're welcome to submit those anytime via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, I'm going to turn it over now to Alex, Max, and Alan.
Great. Sorry. I'm Max. Thanks so much for the introduction, Sharon. Really excited to share the findings from this survey that we ran. I think it's helpful to sort of start by talking about the origins for the project. Like I imagine many people on this call, we were all fairly depressed in November 2024. And there was much talk at the time about this being the realigning election. And what this meant was that it was the election in which we really saw a move of working class voters away from the Democrats. Speaking personally as a sort of political scientist that sort of tracked debates about political realignment for a very long time, both in America and in other countries, this has been a debate that has centered. It's a long-term debate because it's a long-term trend, and but what was sort of scary about 2024 was that I think a lot of that debate has focused on the movement of white working class voters away from the center left and in America, the Democrats. But in 2024, what we saw was this was a trend that was no longer just sort of centered on white working class voters. We saw black working class voters and Hispanic working class voters in particular move away from the Democrats. And as tempting as it is to sort of jump in with another commentary on the eternal debate over why Democrats are struggling to connect with the working class, we thought a better angle of approaching this question was to sort of consider and question what role Labor plays in modern elections and in the political mobilization of working Americans at elections going forward and in 2024. And so we were particularly drawn to this question because of an exit poll that suggested that union members were one of the few social groups and actors that managed to sort of maintain high levels of support for the Democrats. And so it was sort of squaring these two trends, where on the one hand, we saw evidence of significant political de-alignment, but on the other, we saw organized labor maintain a steadfast allyship of the Democrats and engage in significant political mobilization towards that cause. And I think that one thing that unites us as a research team in approaching this question is the way in which existing researchers sort of approach the question of unions' political practices and members' political behaviors, where most surveys have included too few union members to analyze differences across the labor movement. And because not all union members are the same, they're likely to vary based on their age, ethnicity, and probably most obviously the industry that they work in. So we sort of wanted to approach this question by sort of considering that variation both between union members and non-union workers and across and variation inside the labor movement in terms of how they were politically mobilized and the political identity of union members. So the contribution of this report is really twofold. Firstly, we ask in 2024, how did union members approach politics? How did this compare with non-union workers? And how did this vary inside the labor movement? And secondly, we ask how were union members engaged and mobilized by their union? What worked and where are avenues for improvement? And so to answer this question, we commissioned YouGov to conduct a survey of 3,000 people. This was divided into two subsamples. So one of non-union workers, where we had 1,366 respondents, and another of union members, where we had 1,634 respondents. And so I think the real advantage of our approach is that we're able to construct sufficient subsamples in terms of union members' demographics, but perhaps most uniquely individual unions. And so we determined that 50 was a minimum number of observations for each union to be included in any analysis. And so while we want to be cautious, we can still report preferences and attitudes of these union members. And so the table on the right-hand side of the slide reports the number of respondents for each union that we were able to sort of include given this consideration. And so before I hand over to Alex and Alan, I want to quickly run through some of the headline findings. So the first is that our results confirm that union members are most likely to vote, and they're most likely to vote for Democrats at higher rates than non-union workers. But there was still substantial variation between unions, with just 33% of Teamsters voting for Kamala Harris, compared with 77% of NEA members. Our survey also discusses inflation, which was an important issue in 2024, and given recent decisions and actions, is probably likely to be an important issue going forward as well. And so while there were no major differences in the way that union members experienced inflation, union members were much more likely to attribute blame for inflation to corporate greed rather than decisions made by the Biden administration. At the same time, when we tried to identify where union members received information about inflation, it was notable that to us that only 12% reported receiving information from their union. And so this is a sort of potential missed opportunity. And then again, in terms of missed opportunities, we were surprised that unions, and particularly union locals, appeared to opt out of political mobilization in the run-up to the election, with 56% of members reporting no political mobilization in the year before the election. And finally, we found a really interesting correlation between union members' knowledge of the Biden administration's policies and their likelihood of voting for Kamala Harris. So the more union members tended to know about the more policies that union members were able to identify, the more likely that they were to vote for Kamala Harris. But at the same time, a significant number of union members were unaware of the Biden-Harris administration's labor policies. So with that, I'll hand over to Alan.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, so I'll first talk about union members and their voting patterns in 2024. And so we were first interested in just comparing union members against non-union members. So were union members more likely to vote for Kamala Harris? And we found yes, they were, in fact. So specifically in our survey data, we find that 56% of union members were likely to vote for Harris or reported voting for Harris versus non-union workers who were, sorry, Max, can you go back to the previous slide? Compared to non-union workers. Yeah. And we also saw that union members were less likely to vote for Donald Trump compared to non-union workers. And so this is pretty consistent, right? With historical findings, this is a long trend that union members are more likely to vote for Democratic politicians. But as Max previously said, we're really interested in variation between union members, right? We might have this average showing that union members are more likely to vote for Democrats, but union members could be very different. And so we broke down these results by union affiliation. And so I'm going to focus in on kind of the two ends here, but you can see we have other unions as well. But the NEA and the AFT were much more likely to vote for Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. So in the NEA, we're talking about 78% versus 15%. For the AFT, 75% for Harris versus 14% for Trump. But on the other end of that, we have the UFCW and the Teamsters. The UFCW voted for Harris at 49% versus 39% for Trump. The Teamsters 33% for Harris versus 49% for Trump. And so this findings, suggests there's just so much more variation between union members than we previously could have captured by just comparing union versus non-union. And so I just want to point out two potential sources of distinction that might distinguish why some union members are more likely to vote for Kamala Harris versus other union members. One is that we know the NEA and AFT, their workers and members are more likely to be highly educated. They're more likely to be in the public sector. This might help explain why they're more likely to vote for Kamala Harris. Of course, we don't know necessarily if any of these things are causal, right? That would require a different type of research design, but it does suggest there's a lot of variation that we should be more attentive to when thinking about union members and their political preferences. Max, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. Yeah. So then we were interested in how union members and non-union workers experienced inflation and how they talked about inflation. How did they understand it? And who would talk to them about economic news more broadly? So we were interested in inflation, right? Because inflation was a really big issue in 2024. It was a commonly cited top issue for voters. And there was a really interesting finding that incumbents in countries with high inflation were much more likely to lose re-election. And so we were interested in a few things. First, we wanted to understand, well, how did union members and non-union workers experience inflation? Second, how do they explain inflation? Where does it come from? Who is the cause of inflation? And then lastly, we were interested in how union members got economic information. Next slide, Max, thanks. So we asked union members and non-union workers how they experienced inflation in 4 big categories. First, we asked them whether they experienced inflation in groceries, then gas, rent, and their mortgage. And so what's really interesting here is that it seems like union members and non-union workers actually experienced inflation in fairly similar ways. The percentages that they reported were fairly similar. There's not a big difference between the ways that union members and other workers actually experienced inflation. But then we asked, well, how did they explain this? How do they understand the causes of inflation? Max, can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. Oh, sorry, one back. Perfect. Okay. So we wanted to understand who they blamed for high inflation. Specifically, we were interested in whether union members were more likely to attribute inflation to corporate greed versus the government. And that's what we find. Union members were much more likely to attribute inflation to corporate greed, while non-union workers were more likely to attribute inflation to the government. And I just want to point out some variation between different unions. The NEA and the AFT members were more likely to blame corporate greed versus union members in the Teamsters, the SEIU, and the UFCW. An additional interesting finding was that those who believed that corporate greed was the main explanation for inflation, they were much more likely to vote for Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. And so next we wanted to understand, well, where were union members getting their information, right? We know that unions tend to provide political information. At least this is what the previous research has shown. And so we asked union members, where are you getting your economic information from? Interestingly, many of them didn't actually report that they're getting economic information from their union. Only 12% of union members actually reported that the union was their main source of economic information. Instead, they are actually very much like other non-union workers. TV and radio and newspapers were really the main sources of economic information for them. And so, big picture, over 85% of union members received economic information from other non-union sources. And so this could have been a missed opportunity. We don't know necessarily if unions had given more information about the economy, whether this would have downstream effects on these other political outcomes, but it does seem that there was a lot more room for them to talk more about the economy and provide information to their members. So I'll pass it off to Alex for the next set of slides.
Thanks, Alan. So Alan talked to you a little bit about how unions were communicating, or in some cases not communicating to their members about the economy and inflation. And another aspect of our survey was zooming out and asking about political engagement that members received from their union overall. So next slide. One of the things we were especially interested in were whether union members were being asked by their local union to participate in politics in 2024 in a variety of ways. And so in the figure here, I've shown you the different types of political mobilization requests that members could have recorded receiving from their local union. And the top line finding that stood out to us from this item in the survey was really how few union members were actually being mobilized by their local union in politics. I think Max, Alan, and I all studied unions' engagement in politics, and our first instinct is to think about all of the ways that unions engage their members in politics by providing information and opportunities to participate in the political process. But the survey is a good reminder that many union members actually aren't politically mobilized by their union, or at least do not recall being politically mobilized in this way. We find that about 56% of union members reported that they did not receive a political ask from their union in 2024. When we look at the kinds of asks that union members did receive, it tended to most commonly revolve around asks to share political information with friends, family members, coworkers, or other people in their community. About 20% of union members reported this kind of ask. And the least common request that union members received was really around political contributions to campaigns and candidates. Only about 10% or slightly less of union members reported this kind of ask. The other thing to note is that political requests tended tended to cluster together. So if you were a union member in a union that was involved in politics, you tended to receive many different types of requests. And if you were in a union where you didn't tend to receive requests, you didn't receive any requests at all. So they tended to be more of an all or nothing kind of thing. Next slide, please. As Max previewed at top, we were very interested as well in understanding how union members perceived the labor agenda that the Biden-Harris administration was working on. We heard the president and many observers of the administration describe the administration, rightly in my opinion, as one of the most pro-labor presidencies since FDR, ranging from the kinds of regulations and enforcement activities at the labor agencies like the Department of Labor and the National Labor Relations Board, but also including many other agencies like the Department of Energy and Transportation and Commerce that hadn't traditionally thought about labor issues, but were trying to promote greater labor standards and organizing as part of the historic infrastructure investments that the administration was embarking on. So a question that we had was, did union members see these kinds of policies that the administration was doing? And in particular, did they see them and then feel them in their lives and think that they were helping their union, that these policies actually had a beneficial effect on their union? So we asked survey respondents about 9 policies that the Biden-Harris administration had pursued, ranging from things like state and local fiscal relief during the COVID-19 crisis that was intended to keep teachers and other public educators on public payrolls, to the passage of legislation as part of the American Rescue Plan Act that restored union pension funds and restoring those pension benefits to members. The first thing to note is a large majority of union members had heard about at least one of these policies. About 70% or so had heard about at least one of these policies. But that still means that around a third of union members hadn't heard about any of these policies, which I thought was especially notable given how much the administration was really hoping that union members would perceive these policies and their impact in their lives. The other thing to take away from this chart is that when you look on a policy by policy basis, most union members, and in most cases, a large majority of members, thought that these policies helped their union specifically. So you can see here the blue bars here are often well above 50%, indicating that over half of union members thought that these policies had helped them. When we look to see the policies that union members were more ambivalent about or thought maybe hurt their union, it tended to be the investments in clean energy that were most controversial amongst union members. And that makes sense to the extent that some of these investments might have meant transitions for, say, unionized workers in manufacturing facilities, making traditional automobiles, or in extractive industries. The last thing to say is for any one individual policy, about 10 to 20% of union members had not heard about them. And the policies that people tended to be most aware of were the COVID-19 fiscal relief measures, and the union members tended to be least aware of the investments in semiconductors as part of the CHIPS and Science Act. Next slide, please. So digging into this question of why some union members might have perceived and felt these policies through their union and why some union members may not have perceived these labor policies, we looked at the relationship between how frequently union members said that their local talked to them about what the federal government was doing and the number of policies that they hadn't heard about. So we're looking to see here if union members who said that their local talked to them more frequently about the Biden administration were also more likely to perceive more of these policies and understand them and have an opinion about them. And that's exactly what we find here. So on the x-axis, we're showing you how frequently union members said that their local talks about the federal government with them, ranging from every week or two to never. And then on the y-axis, we've put here the number of policies that union members didn't hear about or didn't know about from the Biden administration. And we see here that the less frequently union members heard from their local about the federal government, the more policies union members just didn't know about. And so again, this isn't causal evidence, but it does suggest that unions and especially local unions are an especially important channel of information about the federal government and what it's doing and the kind of impact that it can have on union members. Next slide, please. So the last analysis that we wanted to share with you was a hypothesis that I think many folks who worked in the administration, myself included, thought about the labor policies, that by showing that the federal government was delivering for union members, that it would help the union members think about the federal government as benefiting their union and then casting votes for Vice President Harris, who is a key part of the administration's labor agenda. And so what we analyzed here and what we report in this figure here is the extent to which union members thought that they were helped by the Biden labor agenda, and then their probability of voting for Harris in the 2024 election. And we find a pretty strikingly strong positive relationship. That is to say, the more policies that a union member perceived as helping them and their union, the more likely they were to vote for Vice President Harris. And this relationship holds up when we control for partisanship and ideology and even look at variation within individual unions. Again, it's not causal evidence, but it does suggest support for the hypothesis that by doing so much to help the labor movement, that union members might have been more favorable to Vice President Harris and may be part of the explanation of why union members stuck with the Democratic Party, at least at the federal level, in the aggregate, as opposed to shifting away in the ways that Max described. With that, we're excited to turn things over to Mike Podhorzer for comments and really excited for the discussion that we'll have with him and the other panelists.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for inviting me and for doing this really important study. I should also acknowledge that we have Steve Rosenthal in the audience, who is also a political director of the AFL-CIO. So you've got a lot of experience here to look at what you did. And one of the things, and I've known Alex for quite a while and really appreciated the work he's done in this area. I think one of the things that I find really interesting about the survey is that it shouldn't surprise anyone that these are the kind of things that within the AFL-CIO we spend a lot of time studying continuously. And so after I sort of do a little bit of a deck on some things to think about when you think about the labor political program, I'll come back to the specific things in that survey. So this is really meant to be a couple overview points about labor and politics. And one thing that I think is always important to remember is that while this survey, and I think the way most people think about labor and politics is in terms of the each like presidential election, most of what labor and politics is about is at the state and local level. And it is not a coincidence that the country is pretty much sorted into almost every state legislative chamber that is democratic is in a state that is not right to work and vice versa. And that we're in, states where after Citizens United, billionaires came to dominate state politics. That has not been the case yet in states where unions still have considerable political power. So there was a lot of in there about union communication, and I want to show sort of the infrastructure through which union communication can take place. Right? For the AFL-CIO, there are 50 state federations, central labor councils in every major city, covers every area in the country. And then there are, of course, affiliates. And at the state and local level, those central labor councils and state federations consist of those affiliates. And overall, that ends up, there are still in this country more than 11,000 locals, and about 20% of current members of labor unions have at one point or another served as stewards, business agents, or elected officers. And again, in terms of thinking about politics and labor, it's important to remember that in every union, there is democracy and politics in terms of who becomes the local president all the way up to the national or international president. And this again is something Steve has a lot to do with, is the modern labor political program came out of a period of kind of dormant member communication, and really was intent on centering member to member communication. And the way that usually happens is in a more formal sense, say door to door in the weekend before election for GOTV and such. But it also takes place in terms of communication in the workplace, and which is really important. And I think one of the things we learned in terms of analysis is that that kind of communication doesn't feel like communication from the union to people in the workplace. So that it's remembered as, Nancy or Joe, who they work with, talking to them, not a branded union communication. So I think there's more of that going on than a survey detects. Also in this period, things became much more data-driven and much more targeted. And so again, to the study, in terms of the most branded labor communication, which tends to be male, the most unions, especially after 2016, are pretty diligent about not sending political communication to members they believe are going to be supporting Trump or Republicans. And that, I think, accounts for some of the lack of communication. I think also that given an ambivalent relationship between a lot of the unions and the National Democratic Party, there is traditionally much less communication, political communication outside of battleground states and presidential elections. So in a national survey, there are just places where unions did not invest a lot of resources in that. It's also important to remember, especially for a while when there were a lot of anti-union initiatives, that that's an important part of the program, as well as members running for office. So it's very incomplete to think about labor and politics in terms of quadrennial presidential elections. So going to the 24 election, and this is just some points from the AFL-CIO. The NEA does a huge amount, and Kim will talk about that. Each of the affiliates does a tremendous amount, but this was sort of order of magnitude scale of what communication that went through the AFL-CIO's data collection, and just give you a sense of like the size of what happened. And then the AFL-CIO also does a paid communication program, especially targeting folks that the national union may either not want to talk to directly, or that they want to add more weight to, and that's very data-driven. This polling, and I think it's interesting, is it matches to the survey data for progress before the election, ask net trust in handling labor union policy, increasing wages, protecting manufacturing jobs, trade policy, and jobs on the economy. And the top blue bars are the net trust of union households, Harris over Trump, the brown ones for non-union households. So even more than the difference in vote, the union members trusted that. And I think that speaks to an important part of this, which is that when you think about the relationship between the union and its members, the union members are overwhelmingly favorable to their union. Remember that their main connection with the union is their contract, their pension, their health benefits, and so on. And so there's an understanding that the union, when it talks about economic issues, is looking out for their interests, even if when they say that, say, Harris is better, even if for other reasons the member is going to still vote for Trump or Republicans. This is based on VoteCast, and it shows Harris's net in 20 and 24 in the whole country and in the battleground states, and the same thing overall for the country. According to VoteCast, the vote for Harris, the margin was 2 points more for her than Biden 4 years before. The widening gap between union and non-union in CCS was already there in 2022. And I think it really is just one more way that corroborates the idea that people who were in unions, especially in the battleground states, were much more aware and attentive to both what the Biden administration had done, but also the dangers of Trump administration. It's going to wrap up by talking about labor's role now and going forward. One thing that I think is really important and I think is not getting enough appreciation is just how important labor is, not just in the United States, but anywhere in fighting authoritarian regimes. It is commonplace to understand Trump's attacks on the media or the law firms or universities or the judiciary as part of a standard authoritarian playbook to consolidate power. But getting rid of unions and disabling them is just as much a part of that formula. But in the United States, for a lot of reasons, that is pushed to the side. But when you think about solidarity in Poland or the miners in South Africa, right, there really aren't examples of being able to successfully overcome totalitarianism or authoritarian regimes without the collective power that can be expressed through unions. And I think one of the things that is really important in thinking about the trends in American politics, especially since the Great Recession, is the extent to which the public confidence in almost every major institution in this country has tanked, except for unions, right? Although again, that's something that gets almost no attention. You see up here, it's like since 2009, unions are the only ones where people have expressed a great deal more confidence. And when you do it as a net and organized labor, you see exactly what's going on. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that despite like virtually no attention to it in the mainstream media, people see the success of the auto workers and others, and see that as an institution that can work for them. And as a result, again, running counter to the trends in every other way we think about it, since 2009, approval for unions has not just increased, but has increased across the partisan spectrum, even though unions code democratic for a lot of people. I think this is really critical as we think about how we get through the next several years. So here are some of the things that the labor movement is already engaging and planning in for 2025. Shortly after Doge started, they started the Department of People Who Work for a Living as a way to both challenge what's going on as part of the early demonstrations outside the Treasury Department and so on. Then when the collective bargaining executive order came out, it really consolidated the labor movement to an extent that really hasn't been there for quite a long time, with even the building trades coming out strongly against the attacks on collective bargaining. Again, this isn't just about union members, it's about the possibility of collective action against the administration. The building trade, I raised Abrego Garcia because the building trades have been pretty vocal in attacking the administration over his abduction because he was a building trades apprentice. And I think it really speaks to thinking about unions not in sort of an adjunct to the Democratic Party or political organization, but one in which solidarity matters a great deal. And also, I forgot the bullet, but just started a Rise Up, which is service for all federal employees, and others are being attacked and let go. We're part of the hands-off demonstrations over the last several months. Over April, I mean, there have been hearings around the country about the impact of Trump's plans and putting together an agenda. May Day, participated in May Day protests over the summer. I think they're going to be really engaged in working through those channels I listed at the beginning to educate members about what Trump's doing, with an aim to a very action-oriented Labor Day. And so that's kind of the prepared overview. In terms of the survey, as I say, I think that it just more corroboration of what we were able to see throughout this period. I think, though, that one of the things that is really important to pull out, though, is the extent to which unions affect the worldview of members in a way that makes, say, the inflation finding completely sensible, which is that if you're a working person in a union, you understand that your wages are not just like what they are, that it is something that the bosses give you. And so there's a just different understanding of why prices go up, why corporate greed, all those things that doesn't depend on receiving a new communication to believe that. And I think that's really important. The other thing, and there's a small point, but we did every cycle, I mean, literally, for most of these cycles, hundreds of thousands of interviews, and absolutely the point estimate on the NEA is pretty close to accurate, although I'll let Kim speak to it. I think the Teamsters is almost certainly lower than it actually was based on folks I know. But that's just a small point. So I think I'll stop there and give some more time back so we can have more conversation.
Great. Well, thank you, Mike and Alex and Max and Alan. So now we are going to bring into the conversation Kim Anderson and Stephanie Ternulo. Stephanie, you want to come on your camera? Great. And so now we're going to sort of step back a little bit and do some sense making of the results of the survey, and then also like where this fits in what else we know about the role that unions play, especially in presidential elections. So I'm going to start with a question for both of you, which is, what surprised you the most in the results that we found from this survey? What jumped out at you as particularly interesting, or that challenges some of the ways that you think about, Kim, your own unions, experience, Stephanie, what you've seen in looking at these questions over time? Kim, why don't you start us off with like from the ground? What's
Sure.
you?
Sure. I think what surprised me, I guess, it always disappoints me because I want to see, 100% of our members engaging, was the figure that 40% or, 38% of our members reported that they had not been asked or politically engaged by the union. Now, it may have something to do with the way in which the question was worded when we say by your local union, because our members are pretty accustomed to hearing from the NEA national around presidential races, hearing from their state affiliate around gubernatorial, statewide races, and hearing from their local union when it comes to school board races. So our members have a really very intimate a relationship with all levels of government because they understand the role that each plays in financing the public education system, in setting standards, et cetera. So that may have something to do with it. It may also have something to do with something that Mike mentioned earlier, which is targeting.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons, most labor unions do not have the resources to engage in every single political race up and down the ballot in every single state. We just don't. And that is by design. That is one of the things that certainly folks on the far right have been trying to do, which is to deplete labor unions' resources to engage our members and to engage our members to engage the public about issues as well as candidates and ballot measures. So while it was a little bit surprising, the more I thought about it, there may be an explanation there.
Great. And I want to come back to that question about battlegrounds, but let's turn to Stephanie now too about what surprised you.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I think the puzzle for me maybe coming out of this, and maybe like Kim, I've tried to wrap my head around a way in which it's not that puzzling, but is this inflation finding, this finding that union members attribute inflation much more to corporate greed rather than government policy. But at the same time, they're not really getting economic information from their unions. Only 12% say they're getting economic information from their unions. So how can we make sense of that? Like on the one hand, it suggests that unions could play this really important role that we often think they play in framing problems, like Mike was talking about, teaching people that their wages don't fall from the sky and that they're created at the collective bargaining table. But on the other hand, unions aren't telling them this, apparently. So how are they kind of coming to these conclusions? And I think, one possibility is obviously sort of maybe a reverse causality here. If the NEA and the AFT are driving those results, then maybe teachers are always college educated, and so they're more likely to be Democrats in the first place, and so maybe unions aren't doing anything. Alternatively, it could be the case, and I think it's a combination of both of these things, that unions' political activity is much more extensive and important, like Mike was describing, than what we can observe just in a snapshot of one election. I think also, as Kim was saying, and I find this in my research too, that usually engagement with union locals on politics is about local politics, not about federal elections. And so if you're learning about politics from your local, it's going to be about the city council or the school board. It's not going to be about President Biden or maybe the economy more generally. And you're also learning a lot from the people you work with, as Mike was saying, through this kind of casual workplace discussion that doesn't feel like something formally from your local. And so I think there's a lot that unions could potentially be doing to for their members and their members' politics beyond just these formal communications that might trigger a memory on a survey.
Right. That's really helpful. And I think it's just highlighting the fact that this question about the battleground and how the way that our politics have developed, that in a presidential cycle, there is so much focus on battleground that maybe I think we need to do some different research, and we actually, and we can, when we open it back up to everybody, talk a little bit more about how we crafted the survey and the challenge of doing a survey like this with just battleground states to see, like, and it would be interesting to know how different these results would be. But Kim, I want to come it back to you again to bring it back to like more practically, like what does the NEA's political engagement program look like? So Mike gave us sort of like that big AFL sort of vision, but practically, what did you guys do? In particular, how did that differ for your members in battleground states versus non-battleground states?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So at the outset, let me say that our membership overall tends to be very, very reliably high voting. Over 90% of our members vote. And we're proud of that. We also, in post-election cycle polls, invariably, we will get very, very high percentage ratings for the extent to which the union's recommendation and the union's information is trusted and is a part of their decision-making process when they go to vote. So that is helpful. And I would say that we're talking about this in the context of elections, but really what begins and starts elections and should be happening all year round in all labor unions is the mobilization and engagement on issues, right? And so we begin our campaign cycle through lobbying, and we engage our members. And that may be why I think there's probably a higher percentage of our members who do understand and attribute inflation to things like corporate greed, because we're always engaging them on lobbying efforts around how the government is allocating resources, right? And some of those choices, particularly at the federal level, but some of those choices at the federal, state, and local level always end up being a juxtaposition of, do we want to invest in our kids? Do we want to invest in social safety net programs? Do we want to invest in human beings and families? Or do we support tax cuts for the wealthy? Do we support corporate loopholes, right? Those are regular parts of our conversations with our members, even long before we get into candidate preference conversations. So, that I think is an incredibly important thing that all labor unions do, but we need to intensify clearly. And so the other piece of that, and I'll get back to your question, Sharon. The other piece of that is that I think labor writ large, and I'm hearing the late and great Bill Spriggs, former AFL economist, in my head, who would always talk to us and teach us about the fact that labor was the real institution driving popular education, not only among union members, but the public, about the role of government, basic financial and economic concepts, and things like that. So people understood that when you pay taxes, you pay into a collective that is decided through a representative process that then comes and backs to benefit you, right? And benefit your quality of life, et cetera. So the extent to, and our opponents know that. There's a reason why people are trying to tear down the labor movement. It's because they don't want us to educate people about that. And so, that is an overarching role that labor needs to play, but it's become even more difficult to play that when we are on defense fighting for our survival. So let me just say that at the outset. With regard to how we engage our members, certainly we educate our members about the issues at stake, candidates' positions. We have political screening committees. We endorse candidates. We also take positions on ballot measures. We run a member-to-member campaign, so members talking to other members. So 67% of our members engaged in talking with their friends and family and other members. through this last political cycle. We also have members who we train to share information online. We also train our members. We did something new this year and instituted a truth teller squad, which was training our members about how to spot disinformation and how to post factual information to counter misinformation and disinformation. And we also do member to public engagement. So we have amazingly creative, wonderful educator members who are funny and passionate and caring and warm. And we unleashed them to create their own content and share online, which member voices are really, really important. We are important messengers to the community, and particularly when our members are talking about their favorite subject, which is their kids, their students. So we've done that. We've also engaged in obviously collective action. We push our members to volunteer into candidate campaigns. We have lots and lots and lots of members. It's hard for us to even capture sometimes the percentage, but when we are able to engage in kind of data sharing agreements, we have seen as many as 20% of our members volunteering into candidate campaigns. So that's over 500,000 people. That's about 580 million or 1,000 people volunteering for candidates campaigns or ballot measure campaigns. And finally, that the higher levels of activism, we are seeing increasing numbers of our own members running for office, which we're thrilled about. And so those are some of the things that we do to engage our members, to engage others, and to engage the public, and then some.
That's awesome. Stephanie, so one thing that motivated us to do this survey was obviously both going into the 2024 election, but I think even more coming out of the 2024 election was so many more people talking about working class voters. I don't think I've heard that phrase used so much in sort of popular media ever before. So you talk a little bit about what your research shows and your thinking around the role that unions play in working class voters' political identity, and maybe how that's changed, particularly in like post-industrial areas of the country.
Yeah, so I think that my book is actually the findings in my book are actually really consistent, I think, with some of the findings from this report in a very different way. One of the findings from this report is that as we've already discussed, something like 56% of union members aren't being asked to be mobilized into politics by their locals specifically. And yeah, we've just heard from Kim and Mike telling us about all of the extensive member engagement that their unions and the AFL-CIO are engaged in with their members, right? Particularly in battleground states. And I think that one thing that my book offers to make sense of these things is this close look at these three white post-industrial cities that had all been previously part of the Democratic coalition. But now today, only one is still sort of voting reliably Democratic. And in a lot of ways, that makes it an outlier because although the 2024 election might have seemed like this big headline change for working class voters, particularly for white working class voters, their kind of defection from the Democratic Party has been going on since at least the 1960s. And so a lot of the former industrial heartland that used to be solid blue territory, those are the battleground states now, right? As we all know. And what I find is that this outlier case that is still voting Democratic is voting Democratic precisely because of the impact of organized labor on both members and non-members in the community. It's a place where organized labor is still really involved in local politics, in endorsing candidates for office, in getting folks out to vote. And as one of the members I interviewed told me about doing this kind of member-to-member contact Mike was talking about, trying to convince his friends at work to vote their job and not vote on issues that are unrelated to their job, right? And so in that context, I saw this sort of really strong kind of persistence of working class politics within the Democratic Party that is really rare, particularly among white working class voters in 2016, 2020, 2024. But as I said, that case is the outlier. And it's the outlier, I think, for exactly the reasons that Kim was just talking about. Although unions are clearly still very engaged in politics and have a lot of political muscle, many locals don't. And in my other two cases, there were plenty of unions, plenty of union workers, but they didn't see their jobs as this sort of political proposition, right? I actually interviewed this one teacher, an NEA member, who told me her job is more, she thinks of her union membership as more of an insurance policy. In case something goes wrong in the job, she can go to her union to protect her. She doesn't see the sort of political implications of her employment the way that teachers and electricians and postal service workers in this more politically engaged context felt. And so I think that the challenge that many union locals today face in engaging in political mobilization with their membership can help us understand why so many white working class voters have fled the Democratic Party in the last 60 years, right? And the reason is sort of what Kim was saying. They're on the defensive, right? They've, particularly in right to work states, locals have largely been on the defensive for, in some cases, like Wisconsin, about a decade, in other cases, several decades. And so they don't have the resources to do the kinds of political mobilization that I was seeing in this one field site. And the rarity of that means that white working class voters are largely now voting Republican. But I think it also suggests sort of the potential of unions, which is what we're talking about today, that they can have these kind of incredible impacts, that they can create these outlier cases, they can bring working class voters across racial lines together in this broader working class mobilization. But in a 21st century context, I think it's really challenging for them to do that at the local level. And I think a lot of, as Mike was saying, a lot of the potential impact is at that local level through the member to member contact, through this sort of ongoing infrastructure that doesn't just happen in these quadrennial election cycles. And so that's where the impact can be greatest. And also, it's the most challenging to achieve that impact. We have this kind of real tension.
Yeah, I want to just key in on something that Stephanie said, and that is just to expound a little bit on sort of preference, right? And the case study. What we have found is that you have to begin with issues first. You have to begin with issues and connect the dots then to what those issues mean to union members' careers, what it means to their families, what it means to their communities. And when you do that, the union becomes more trusted because we're giving credible information that is deeply relevant to the union member. We're creating a greater sense of community among union members, a greater sense of the collective, that we're stronger together. And then ultimately people's political behavior then follows suit, right? So in places like, for example, and I'll give you an example, in Kentucky, Ruby Red, Kentucky, in Nebraska, in Colorado, very different states. Colorado being sort of a purple state, Nebraska being and Kentucky being pretty red in terms of voting behavior. In Kentucky, we engaged our members all across the state around a ballot measure that was against private school vouchers. We won every single county, 120 counties. And so that says to me, not just because we were engaging our own members, but our members were creating this mass movement within community members of parents and students and allies around the issue that was salient in their life, right? Did they want their public tax dollars to be diverted to private and religious schools? In many cases, there weren't any private and religious schools in those communities in the first place, right? So people understood it very, very well from an issue perspective. The second piece, I think, from issues first, and demonstrating relevance is, and this was another interesting part of the finding of the study for me, was about people's awareness of, in this case, Biden-Harris policies and the relationship to how they voted. So when the American Rescue Plan, which was a COVID relief package for schools that Alex mentioned, passed, we allocated up to $10 million to give our state affiliates some grant money to hire what we called them ARPA coordinators or ARP coordinators, folks who could actually help our affiliates translate what does this money mean to school districts. And we had a technical assistance network so that our members could then go fight for that money at the bargaining table or with their school boards and raise their voices about how that money would be spent. And we made an intentional choice to brand that money as the Biden-Harris ARP bill, right? It was branded in terms of our communication. So they knew who did it, what they were getting from it, and then how to go raise their voice at the local level to see that that money was spent the way it was supposed to be spent.
Can I just say quickly, I could not agree more with what Kim said about issues first. And I think that particularly in my research, and I think this is true in broader, what we know in political science right now is that, Democrats and Republicans, and actually outside of political science, everyone knows that they don't like each other that much, right? And so if you lead with a message of you're a union member, you should vote for Democrats, Democrats are the party of the worker, lots of people don't believe that right now. And if they're a Republican and they really care about the Republican Party, they're automatically turned off by that message. But having this more routine day-to-day contact with trusted friends and coworkers and people, like Mike said, and like Kim alluded to, don't feel like the formal union, reminding you that, hey, this thing has happened, this is really important for us, that kind of day-to-day communication, that slowly over time can build to something where someone might say, hey, wait a second, why am I still voting in this way if actually it's this set of candidates, it's the Biden-Harris ARP, it's this party that is benefiting me economically, but that takes time, and leading with party first, I think, can be a huge turnoff to voters.
Right. There's so much there, and I think we'll get back to a lot of what you two just raised when we bring everybody back in. But I want to make sure we get to this idea that, again, the survey comes out of this bigger body of work that we're looking at on the relationship between and the feelings that union members have about political democracy. And Kim, I think now all of our listeners know that NEA is the biggest union in the United States, 3 million members. I mean, by a large margin. But many of our audience members probably don't know that NEA is also one of the most democratic unions. I mean, I have been to a representative assembly, an NEA representative assembly. It is amazing. You guys vote on everything. I mean, from the smallest programs to the biggest decisions, like supporting, which candidate to endorse. So I wonder if you have thoughts about what that level of democracy within the union, how you see that influence your members' relationship to our political democracy, particularly in this moment where I think it's fair to say our political democracy is under an unusual level of stress.
To put it mildly.
Yeah,
and your reference to democratic meaning small d democratic.
Small d, yes, I'm sorry, small d democratic.
Yes. So this is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. So Mike alluded to it earlier, but there are several ways in which union members practice democracy, right? Not just through union elections and who gets elected to be the voice of the union, the local structures of, sometimes they're called shop stewards or business agents. We call them association representatives. Each union has its own verbiage for the person that their colleagues trust to represent their interests, right? And we do that in a variety of ways, shapes, and forms. in our structure. It's not just one person. We actually divide up in a very distributive way. Different people in work sites who will be the rep for professional practice issues. What's the best pedagogy? The rep for bargaining and who's going to take us to the bargaining table. The rep for communication. The rep for that. So as much as we can have a broad representative structure within our union through whom our members have voice and develop a sense of agency, and that system, it produces results, right? It improves the conditions, teaching conditions and learning conditions for our members, raises salaries. It gives members voice about things that they should have a professional voice in, like curriculum, instead of being censored like we see today. When that representative sets of structures, when those work, then people are more likely to have faith in the political context of democracy because they're practicing it and experiencing it at a very personal level in their work life, right? And so it's union elections, it is debate on policies. Sharon mentioned we have our annual meeting, which is called the Representative Assembly. We have anywhere from 7,000 to 9,000 elected NEA members who are delegates that go and represent their colleagues at the local level to vote on the positions that the national union should take. It is actually bigger than the Democratic National Convention. It is bigger than the Republican National Convention. It is crazy. It's wonderful.
It's
But when that works, right, when people can have voice and they feel confident that they've been seen and heard, they are much more likely to fight for their democracy outside the union as well. And that is something that we have seen come home to us in a very big way. And thankfully, that has never been more present in our union today, given the challenges that we face with this authoritarian regime.
Great, thanks. I'm going to invite our other panelists to come back, put their cameras back on, and let's open up this conversation. We've had a number of good questions from the audience, so I'd love to throw this out. And I think start with Max, Alan.
Can you let me turn my video back on?
Can somebody let Mike back in?
Just a comment.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I want to start though with Max, Alan, and Alex, just to help our audience sort of understand. Can you talk one of you, just a tiny little bit about the methodology and how we obviously partnered with YouGov in doing this survey about how YouGov operates, how do they find union members, what were some of the challenges in putting together like the panel, meaning the respondents to this survey. Max, you want to take that? You did a lot of the the back and forth with YouGov.
Yeah, so YouGov have a they have a sort of like a panel of online respondents, and they recruit participants from that panel, and then they choose to sort of match respondents according to the specific demographics that each respondent sort of has. And so for us, like obviously the 3,000 respondents that we had, we really wanted to have a sort of like good division between union members and non-union workers. And so in order to make sure that like each of those subsamples was representative, they were sort of weighted according to sort of scores from a broader sort of demographic survey that was the 2022 current population survey. So the union sample was weighted to be representative of union members by age, gender, race, ethnicity, years of education, region, and employment status. And then as was the non-union worker sample. So that was also weighted to be representative of all employed US adults. So obviously not retirees and not sort of independent contractors or owners of businesses. I think that sort of answers the question.
And Mike, was there something in the conversation with Kim and Stephanie that you wanted to comment on?
Oh, absolutely. A couple things, if you don't mind. I
Sure.
think that, and as I listened, I had probably wanted to do this before, but I thought it was a narrower presentation. I think the idea of this sort of sudden attention to the idea of like working class voters is deeply problematic and a category error. I think that working class is what people who do surveys call people who don't think of themselves as working class. And that what we see is that it's really only inside a union context that there are people who still think of themselves as a working class identity that is activated by linked fate and by identity, which is the most powerful driver for elections, right? And so it is not at all surprising that people who are descriptively and by fiat considered in this category don't themselves think about themselves that way or the issues in that way, right? And this is really connected to the decades-long secular decline, because starting in the 1970s with Carter, there was a fight inside the Democratic Party over whether labor was at the table. And like we lost. And so you had a story about economic prosperity that began in the New Deal and went into the 60s, where there were two sides, right? It was pluralism, and people understood which team they were on and voted accordingly. But the story Democrats have told since Carter, Clinton, Obama, about where economic prosperity comes from is very much not a class story. It's a story about how business and entrepreneurs create jobs and all of that. And so it shouldn't be surprising that Democrats don't activate working class identity, right? And at a policy level, they've been terrible. And I've got to tell you, as someone, and Kim is smiling, but as someone who had to be doing union politics for this entire period, there is a real tension between understanding how bad Republicans will be for union members and how meh at best Democrats are going to be. And one of the things that we did was we're at the not every union, obviously, and it's different in a state context where there are governors who can be really pro-union. But at least at the national level, it was treating in our communication members as adults and not trying to say, Democrats, yay, they're the best, go vote for them, right? It was being clear about what their stakes were. And it also, just sort of incidentally, as I was listening to it, there are the thing that really moves union members to still vote this way, although it used to be a lot more, is like is not at all perceived as union communication, right? It's social proof, right? People who are not paying much attention to politics look at people around them and sort of say, oh, okay, they all vote, so I should vote. They all seem to be favoring Harris, so I guess we should vote for Harris. And one of the big demonstrations of this that we managed to do was in 2008, when Obama got the nomination, there was a lot of racial and tension inside a lot of the unions about that. And the strategy that we embarked on was to figure out which locals were like 50-50 or worse, and then find people to be very visible there that people were supporting Obama. And in the end, it went from being not great to about 2-to-1 Obama in the election. But people wouldn't have necessarily on a survey said they heard from their union, right? They saw lots of people showing up with Obama jerseys or whatever. right? Which is still us doing it, right? And that's really important because it's the least impactful thing is a letter we send them, right? The most impactful thing is the context they show up to and understand work every day.
So maybe I'll just say three quick things, and two will just be plugs for the full report. We could only share a subset of results, and I know there have been a bunch of great questions in the chat about sectors and unions beyond those that we reported breakouts for. And to be clear, as Max mentioned, we were sampling from all union members, not just the unions that were listed on the screen. And in the report, we have some breakouts by, for instance, construction and manufacturing, so you can get a sense of how this looks different across those sectors as well. The second thing to note from the report is we did drill into union information about state and local issues versus national issues. And there are, as you would expect, some big differences across unions, like the NEA and AFSCME, where a lot of the focus is on local and state politics, just see much higher levels of communication on those kinds of issues. The last thing to say, and really building on the great exchange from Kim and Mike on the importance of the broader social context that unions create, not just these one-off transactional communications. That's something I'll just put in a quick plug that Alan and I are looking into around union socialization more generally. And for instance, on the survey, we were asking, how often does your union host social events where you and your family go? How often do they have newsletters or orientations for members? Or how often do they have business meetings that you might attend? And these are all intended to pick up on that broader social context. And maybe unsurprisingly, we find a really strong correlation between those kinds of activities and members' perceptions that they're well represented in politics by their union, and also mobilization into union activities. So that may pick up a little on what you're talking about.
Ma'am, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to get back in here?
I was going to do an amen to Mike, which is a common thing for me to do. So it's true. Alex, to thread the needle between both Mike and your comments, I think we have, aided by Harvard, actually. We did some research with folks at Harvard about, looking into why people join the union. And in our case, we did it specific to NEA. And we had some great research about the big hire, right? And what we found, obviously, were things that you would expect, right? The voice being part of something larger than oneself, to improve one's quality of life, one's mastery of their profession, etc. Obviously, wages, salaries, and benefits, conditions of employment. But the secondary thing that was most important for us in terms of fashioning a more robust approach to organizing and organizing among our members and organizing all the time is creating that sense of belonging, that culture of connectedness that leads to those informal connections that Mike just talked about, right? Like, we have a culture now. Every Wednesday we wear red. We wear red for Ed. Like, that's just like what we do. Right. So in terms of things that actually get associated with the union identity and what we stand for, there are so many more informal things, water cooler moments, if you will, that happen in union life that may not necessarily be attributed and talked about by a union member as a union activity, but it's part of their social fabric. It's part of what creates a sense of family and shared purpose and shared value that is both hard to quantify, but also something we're deeply grateful for and try to accelerate every single day, because we know that is what is part of the secret sauce that fuels our strength and our vibrancy and people's willingness to stick with the union when we're under assault, stick with the union when we're going after really positive things for kids and our members in their lives, and stick with the union because we're able to articulate there's some really important things at stake here, right? Our democracy is under threat, guys. Now's the time. It's our responsibility. And so they listen because they've already been socialized in that kind of family context.
I just want to thank him for the shout out for the work that we've done together, and to tell everybody to stay tuned, because we will, in the next few months, have more to share about this really important topic about the sense of belonging that American workers, I think, are really craving and how a union can engage with that feeling. Stephanie, did you want to get in?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think, I mean, I everything that Kim and Mike are saying is sort of music to my ears, and it's really definitely what I argue in my book. But I also just want to emphasize something that Kim said earlier to kind of maybe make sense of some of the findings also of the survey. She sort of made this comment about what unions should be doing year round, and then how difficult it is to do that when they're on the defensive. And so I think a lot of the heterogeneity that Alan, Max, and Alex are picking up on in their survey is capturing that tension between like the beauty that Kim is saying that can come from the social context and Mike is describing within a union, and then in these really subtle ways cultivating this politics, but then the challenges to actually doing that on the ground, on the day-to-day, depending on what sector you're in, what state you're in, and all those things. And I think that's one of the strengths that we're getting from this really great data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Then,
yeah, quick, Mike, and then I want to do a quick lightning round.
Kim, I think this is really, really important and unappreciated in what was said about unions and the practice of democracy. Things have become so attenuated that if you're not in a union or some other thing like that, you basically don't understand the idea that you negotiate with each other for an optimum solution together. If you haven't tried to figure out how to get a contract, and instead we're a society where it's kind of a la carte democracy. Well, do you want this issue? Do you want that issue? Without ever having to contemplate trade-offs or working together on any of these things.
Yep.
And as Kim was saying, like we always lead with issues. And because of Democrats, that often means we're like having one day to say like TPP and the next day you got to vote for Hillary Clinton. Right? You think that's easy? Or like having been like NAFTA and then saying vote for Clinton, right? But only in a context where people understand you can't get everything you want and that you're not just out there like being more and more alienated from the system, right? That is so crucial, right? And that's why it's so important that in this moment, there's greater general appreciation of how important unions are because Trump's coming for us.
So we just have a couple minutes left, and I want to just quickly go around and ask each of our panelists to say this, just to frame, this is an ongoing project. We will be doing more research in this area. So what do you want to know? What questions came up for you to say, quickly say one thing where you think we should look next and maybe go deeper in what this survey yielded or a different direction? So Matt, I'm just going to go around as I see you on my screen. Max, what do you think?
I'm lucky I get to go first, but I think that I think it's really important to like these, and I guess like it hasn't come up as directly in the discussion, but the sort of like preferences around economic issues and as sort of the Trump administration's the impact of the Trump administration on everyday life sort of continues, like sort of tracing the differences between union members and non-union workers and sort of unpacking how being a union member can kind of guide that experience versus being a non-union member, I think is something to really sort of hold on to and keep tracking.
Alan.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Mike, Stephanie, and Kim were talking about was super interesting and kind of a plug for something that Alex mentioned earlier. But, you know, Alex and I are interested in this stuff about these social activities that unions are building and how I think we need to understand more how these building this social union identity could actually be really effective. You know, a lot of my work is focused on these like one-off effects, but I think this type of long-term building of social identity is super interesting and something we should dig more into.
Cool. Mike, one thing, where should we go next?
I feel I have taken enough space. That's good.
Okay. Alex.
I'll just underscore what Alan shared since it's a shared interest of mine and just thank everyone for this great discussion.
Kim, where should we go?
I am +1 to what Max said about understanding sort of basic economic concepts, preferences, etc. But also be interesting to look into the extent to which union members feel that they have a leadership kind of role and space made for them, and the correlation of that sense of leadership, whether it's in a building, whether it's a business agent role, whether it's an elected leader, or whether it's an informal leadership role, and the relationship to civic participation. Because we are seeing the more and more we invest in distributive leadership structures and give more opportunities to more members to lead in discrete ways, the percentage of their activity, not just within the union, but in other contexts, goes up.
So cool. That's really important. Would be really important information for unions to have as they think. We've seen some sort of democratic uprisings within some big unions.
Right.
It'd be interesting to track that. All right, Stephanie, last plug for more research. I know you're a researcher, but where can we collaborate?
I'll just +1 to Alan and Alex's current project and about the socialization processes. And maybe one way of getting at that is trying to look into social networks of union members and the extent to which those networks are derived from the unions themselves versus other contexts to understand how central they are to their lives and their identities.
I will just say I'm obsessed with Rust Belt Union Blues, which I think is, a book for folks who haven't read it, which get at some of these issues. So more to come on all of this. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for really a fascinating conversation. To our partners in doing this research, we will be putting out more takes on this important research. Take a look, dive in on our website, and we look forward to seeing you again in the